Good morning, my name's Ken Gibb. I direct the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence. I also work at the University of Glasgow, so I am delighted to be able to talk to you today about Scotland's National Housing Strategy. Before I do so, however, I'm sure you'll want to join me in wishing Craig Sanderson, who should have been with us in person today, a complete recovery from his recent ill health. What I'm going to do over the next 15 minutes is first reflect on what it means to have a national housing strategy. Second, I'll briefly take you through the narrative of the development of Scotland's approach relating specifically to new affordable housing supply. I'll put the strategy in context. I'll tell you how they attempted to meet key numerical outputs, and I'll describe the mechanisms and institutions at the heart of what the strategy was all about. Third, I'm going to say a little bit about complementary housing policies that Scotland is pursuing as part of a wider set of objectives. Objectives that the government believes adds up to something more than the sum of its parts, that there's a coherent vision as part of that overall package. Finally, I'm going to return to the opening question and consider to what extent the strategy in Scotland fits with a broader sense of what makes an effective national approach to the Scottish housing sector. And I'll also ask, what wider lessons can we learn from this example? A sensible place to start is just to ask, what do we actually mean by a national housing strategy, and what attributes might a good strategy actually have? The diagram you're now looking at is a schematic overview that identifies some of the key features and processes of a national housing strategy. At the top is a sense of the common purpose or vision for national housing. Ideally, this would nest within and be entirely consistent with agreed national public policy priorities. In Scotland, we have something called the National Performance Framework, which is a series of all government priorities, objectives, standards and measurable targets aimed to contribute to moving Scotland towards some fundamental goals like sustainable economic growth. At the same time, there's a local government articulation of these national policies called Local Outcome Improvement Plans. And within the National Performance Framework, there's a section for housing and regeneration, and one of its 4 goals is something called the achievement of a well-functioning housing system, and that's really what the strategy is about. With vision or purpose in place, it logically follows that there must be a consistent and comprehensive investment researching the gap between where we are and where the strategy wants us to get to. Thus, a critical part of the strategy is the evidenced diagnosis of the national housing system, often culminating in a measure of unmet housing need. This also articulates well with local authority, local housing strategies, which draw on well-developed models of housing needs and demand assessments, which have actually been in operation 10 years before we got to have this national housing strategy. At the next level, the analytical part of the strategy involves establishing a policy infrastructure and then building the housing sector support for the strategy. That then needs to have an appropriate mix of policy interventions, policy instruments, and the public finances with which to meet this unmet need gap. This will obviously be constrained by resources and capacity on the ground, but there may be space for innovative interventions to be piloted as well as more conventional policy tools. And the key players will be involved in actual delivery of the strategy will be private housing developers, social housing providers, including in Scotland the local authority sector, housing consumers, the housing regulator, trade and professional bodies, and also in fact the political class, both nationally and locally. The critical penultimate and final stages are deliverability, implementation, and also the monitoring and evaluation of the strategy's components and its totality. This chiefly involves, in the case of supply programmes, the risks that local players can actually use the nationally agreed funds in time and as intended, given the range of development and construction risks they face. We live in a diverse country of 5 million people, and what works in some of our major cities may not work in different market scenarios. It may vary regionally or in small towns or rural contexts, so there are some risks. Note also in the diagram that we expect it to be feedback loops, so that what we learn from the evaluation and monitoring of the strategy should help inform the future strategy and its development too. Before we get to the strategy itself, I need to provide you with a thumbnail outline of what's distinctive about Scottish housing and what constraints shape the way policy and specific interventions might operate in Scotland. Scotland's a devolved nation with a strong parliament, and in particular, housing policy is largely, though not wholly, devolved. Importantly, its public finances were hit hard by the UK government's austerity deficit reductions, and this brought many policy areas, including the future of housing, into sharp relief. Scottish housing policy has diverged in a number of important respects from England. First, we've abolished the right to buy, giving local government confidence to build new homes. Second, Scotland, unlike England, has retained deep capital grants to support the provision of new social housing, including by councils. Like England, however, we retain a strong social housing regulator who stands behind the sector. So let's get a feel for what Scottish housing is like with a couple of diagrams. The first chart shows 10-year change from 1999 to 2015, and I'm grateful to my colleague Nick Bailey who put this chart together using data from the Scottish Household Survey. Home ownership dominates Scotland, but it has plateaued and it's relatively stuck in large part due to mortgage re-regulation after 2008, making the challenge of young people trying to enter home ownership a major policy question in Scotland as it is across the UK. Social renting fell over this period but has stabilised in recent years. But really the big news, and this is news which is true across the UK, is the staggering increase in the private rented sector. In Scotland, the rental market has trebled in size since 1919. And the interesting thing about that is that it's not been policy-led, but it's been market-led. It's the phenomenon of buy-to-let which has driven this amazing change, quite revolutionising how the housing system works. The second diagram that we're looking at now is also from the Scottish Government, and it compares Scottish and UK house prices since the crash. And there's a horizontal line in the diagram, and that's really what the peak was in Scotland and the UK before the crash. While Scotland has its hotspots, such as in Edinburgh, the market recovered much less dramatically here than it did in the UK as a whole, which was of course largely driven by London. There is clear divergence between the two house price series, and that relative flatness in Scotland is surely a good thing. The third diagram, also from Scottish Government statisticians, shows the long-term mix and level of Scottish house building and the different epochs it has enjoyed. The demise of Scottish council house building is clear to see, as is the long-term decline and volatility of new housing supply. A final contextual point to stress is that there have been two independent but officially endorsed pieces of evidence of high and rising national unmet affordable housing need. The first in the mid-2000s suggested an annual level of need at around 8,000 to 10,000 units per annum. A second study around 2015 suggested that this number had increased to 12,000 units per annum, and that really frames what the affordable supply programme we're just about to talk about really comes from. For the last two Parliament terms, which ran from 2011 to 16 and the new one, current one, 2016 to 21, the Scottish Government has set affordable and social housing supply targets. In the earlier Parliament, they were set at 30,000 units or 6,000 units per year, 2/3 of which would be social housing, 1/3 affordable housing, and at least 1,000 units a year would be council housing. In the new Parliament, the target has been increased to 50,000 units over the 5 years, which means 10,000 units per year, and now 70% of the total should be for social rent. Now the 2011-16 target was met, and met with some room to spare, and while it's stretching, the assumption is that the current target will also be met, though it should be said that not everybody would be on that page. Some people might disagree with that. What's, I think, useful to convey are the main forms of intervention that are going to achieve this target. So there are four major mechanisms that are being applied. First of all, and the biggest part, are housing associations building socially rented housing. They receive a capital grant, so the benchmark cost of a new social housing association unit is £120,000, and they'll receive a grant of about up to £72,000. The rest, the balance, will be funded out of private borrowing. Councils also receive capital grants slightly less than housing associations. They receive £59,000, up to £59,000. The balance of their resources is met by a public sector loan. Thirdly, on the affordable home ownership side, an important element has been shared equity, helping people access home ownership. And more recently, fourthly, we have the affordable rent programme. This is a form of grant-funded mid-market rent product. The grant level can be up to £46,000 per unit. Rents are set at a low private rented level based on the housing benefit ceiling that property would enjoy, and the properties are targeted at key workers, and there's an income ceiling on who is accessible for the mid-market property. The diagram you're now looking at shows the combination or the balance of the levels of which tenure and which product met the affordable and social supply target each year. And what you can see is that social housing dominates. Initially, affordable home ownership was important, but clearly growing in the last 5 years is this mid-market rent or affordable rent product. It's worth stressing a couple of other additional features about this programme. Scottish Government sets a budget. It then allocates the funds in terms of local resource assumptions or effectively need and capacity to deliver at a local level. It then works out to ensure that the implementation at an individual site level actually occurs. So it goes through a process where it has the global amount of money to spend, it identifies the resources and the needs at a local level, they work through the planning requirements at the local level, and they try to make sure it's implemented. This is not easy, it's complex, and it has to operate across the whole of Scotland. So recent research by Young and Donoghue suggests that this is a complex, information-rich process that ties in local providers, landowners, a planning system, and the Scottish Government. Inevitably, this process has been variable, it's a learning process for all involved, but it is generally, and I say generally, working sufficiently well for the purpose. The other interesting point on delivery has been the extensive work by the government itself to build consensus and to seek the support of the sector as a whole through, for instance, the Joint Housing Policy and Delivery Group. This is something of a sort of long-term big tent approach to strategy development that keeps in touch with policy performance from a multiple professional standpoint on the ground. Now, some people say it risks becoming a talking shop, but I think there's a genuine self-awareness about the group, there's goodwill, and there's buy-in to the wider vision of what they're trying to achieve. There are perhaps 3 other elements in the housing strategy which go alongside the Affordable Supply Programme. The first of these are legislative reforms to the private rented sector which were enacted in December 2017. Scotland now has indefinite length tenancies and strictly controlled grounds for tenancy termination, unlike the rest of the UK, which adheres to 6-month tenancies as a typical way of contracting in the private rented sector. The government has also introduced limited third generation rent controls, which require a considerable evidence test before they can be implemented, the so-called local rent pressure zones. These are effectively limits above the rate of inflation, so they're rather modest, but they will be a challenge evidentially to actually put together at a local scale. And Scotland is also in the private rented sector experimenting with a pilot time-limited rental income guarantee scheme, which is designed to encourage institutional investors into the build-to-rent sector. The rest of the UK is watching all of this with interest. Second, and 15 years after establishing path-breaking rights-based homelessness legislation, Scotland is pursuing new homelessness policies, both on acute questions like rough sleeping, but also more structural and preventative initiatives with third parties, including the Housing First movement. While much is going on and is rightly lauded, the extent of the challenge continues and is exemplified that just yesterday it was announced that homelessness application figures have risen quite sharply in the last 12 months in Scotland. Scotland, thirdly, also has its own version of the Help to Buy model, which is well known across the UK and beyond. The Scottish version is targeted at helping first-time buyers and helping them purchase new homes in particular, thus supporting the development sector in Scotland as well as the 10-year aspirations of its younger people. One of the other interesting things about this policy is that the money that's used, the public money that's used, actually gets returned to the Treasury when properties are sold or when equity shares increase. So it's a relatively good value for money policy in those terms at least. In conclusion, does all this add up to a coherent housing strategy, and what can we learn from the evolving way that Scotland does housing policy? On the credit side of the balance sheet, we can say that the overall vision is closely aligned to the broader public policy vision for Scotland. It met its objectives in the last Parliament, and it has a decent to good chance to do so again in the current Parliament. It's been able to promote and legislate a series of complementary initiatives, particularly in the private rental market, and the strategy has been widely consulted on and a policy network infrastructure developed to support the programme's work. Specific interventions have evolved and the balance has shifted over time, for instance into the affordable rent sphere. And as part of the longer term focus, attention is now shifting to what happens after 2021. Are there new priorities, or does the affordable supply programme continue? What is definitely required, however, is a more regular, consistent housing needs assessment. We had 10 years between the last two national needs assessments, and we really need to be more up to date than that. There also needs to be much more regular evaluation of interventions and also a monitoring of how we are doing across a range of these housing questions. And we must also recognise just how much work and information is required to connect the national and the local scene. Perhaps this is all just a function of the excessive quantification of housing policy. It might be, well, a numbers game, but it certainly focuses the mind and energies of the sector because of that. In the end, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and both Wales and Northern Ireland are bringing forward affordable supply programmes, and there's much interest both in the reform in the private rented sector and the much more positive environment for council housing in Scotland as a result of the actions of recent years. So in conclusion, I hope this short presentation has been informative and set out the possibilities and challenges of designing and delivering a national strategy on the ground. I look forward to hearing from the organisers how the panel discussions go in this subject, as well as the other affordable housing topics examined at your conference. Thanks for listening and goodbye.